welcome to the Enlightenment. This is Season 2. I'm your host, Daniel, and with me are the OG gang, Peter and Mark. Say hi, Peter and Mark.
Hi, Peter and Mark.
Hello.
And today we will be discussing the philosophy of identity. It's a pretty cool topic. So, starting with the first question. What is identity? Just gotta get our definitions from the get-go.
Define identity.
Identify.
Isn't it like self-referential? Yeah, identify identity. I feel like it's just self-referential, you know? Like, anything's identity is going to be tied up with its definition, you know? Like, I don't want to say it's like a meaningless word, but it's just one of those words that defines like self-reference, you know? So something's identity depends on what that thing is. But in general, it's just the character.
Let's try and go a bit more specific here. I guess the way I've been thinking about it is less like definition and more like personal identity. So, like, what is individual identity would be a better way to frame it.
Probably identity is a spook, right? You know, that's what I'm leading towards currently. You know, like I feel like...
Define spook for those of us in the audience who are not familiar with the concept.
It's like, it's just made up, you know? Like, people think that it's a meaningful concept. But really, it's just obfuscating its own meaninglessness. Like, I feel like identity people can like hide behind, just like, oh, like, I am this, I am that. But so often identity doesn't really have anything to do with what you do. It's more just what you are, or surface level characteristics.
Yeah.
I think for me, I think like a way to look at identity, it's more like what we kind of think ourselves to be. You could look at it kind of like a human, right, versus a person, where like a human is much more of like a biological concept. You know, we have like a human genome, right? But like a person is much more of a social thing. It's just kind of what we phenomenologically like see ourselves as. Something like that would be what like identity is.
I see. Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you more. I think it's, I mean, sure, it's a spook in the sense that it can't be directly pointed to in the real world of like materialist objects, right? It's not a table or a chair, but I think it means something to do with personality and or the mind. So like, it's kind of hard to say. It's sort of like it's what you would write down, you know, if you're starting a profile on some website or whatever, or like a blog, and there is a bio section, and you got to write, you know, sort of a short definition of who you are. You use things that people can understand, like, I don't know, your job, your age, your sex, that kind of thing, to try and sort of present the picture to a stranger of who you are through language, like just using words. Because you're not a word. Obviously, there's no word for you. There's your name, but that's hardly unique usually. And even if it was unique, you'd have to actually know what it means, right? So I think it's probably like a loosely defined collection of things that you would use to try and explain your own mind to someone who's not familiar with it.
So are you saying identity is now,
I think,
synonymous with the mind?
Well, the mind is like a general concept, right? But like, yeah. I'm talking about your mind. Like, your personal identity might be the collection of words that you would use to try and explain what is yourself.
So the identity is less than the self, because it's the self as translated into words.
Right, like the word table is not going to be a perfect description of any particular table, but like it helps you get a sense of what I'm talking about when I say that I'm sitting by a table right now. But I think if we get more concrete, it might be easier to understand. So I don't really know. Did you guys want to add anything before we go to question 2?
I think one thing to also add is like what you were describing, Dan, was like kind of the identity as like your persona, which I can agree with to some extent. But in I believe I haven't read any of this guy, but I've heard a little bit about him. He's a psychoanalyst named, forget his first name, but his last name is Lacan, and so what he thought, right, was that like Freud had like the persona, which is how you present like yourself to like other people. And I don't know if he had a specific word for this, but Lacan had an idea where there's yourself, which you present to yourself, which is like kind of a layer before the actual persona, which presents it to like other people. And so like identity is probably like both of those things, is just how you see like yourself and how you show other people yourself, but it's not like what your actual self is. I mean, it could be, but like almost never, I would say.
So then it's sort of like your identity would be defined by others, really, or rather by your. I like to think about like environment, but I guess it really is other people, in a sense that would define your identity. But then your persona would be something like objective about you, regardless of the company that you're in. Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, I mean, well, no, I think your persona, right, is kind of it's a type of identity. It's an absolute construct, just as identity is, right? Like you tell people, you show people this is how you are, and like while you're with other people, you act in certain ways to like kind of, present a mask to people, right? But then like there's this other like mask inside of that mask, and that mask is like what you tell to like other people, or what you tell to yourself, right? And then there's like the actual self, um, and
What
so
would be the actual
it
self
is
then? Like in contrast with what you tell yourself.
the actual self. Well, I mean, for example, maybe you tell yourself that like I don't know, that you're really like forgiving person, really empathetic, right? But like you're not a very introspective person, so you just tell yourself that. But like in reality, you're not actually very empathetic, right? And so that's kind of the difference, right?
I see. Sort of like
Is
your
that
perception of who
yeah.
you are versus who you actually are.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, and like that perception, I think, is really what's so important about like what identity is.
Interesting. So what you're making is like a distinction. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pierre.
No, because I'm curious now, because like if we're saying that one's identity is one's perception of oneself as distinct from the way that one really is, well then what is the significance of what one really is, considering that we can't go beyond perception, really?
Well, I would say like it's not perception in a I don't know, in like a metaphysical way. It's just kind of like if your like your perception of yourself, I guess it does not necessarily have to be wrong, right? It can be correct, right? But like there was also times when your perception of yourself is incorrect, right? And maybe you need to just perceive more, right? You need to think harder about these things. I guess.
See, but I would
more
almost
introspection.
go so far as to say it's identity is separate from perception of the self. Like, you could have ideas about yourself that are correct or wrong, and perhaps those could be part of your identity. But I don't think that there's like a correct way of having an identity such that it has like an accurate self-image, because I think identity is a different thing from self that can not fully describe it, if that makes sense. And it goes beyond just like, oh, like identity uses words and words are going to be incomplete expressions. I think it's almost like the self is something that cannot be summed up, and any attempt to do so would distort it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Like, people rely on cliches, like they'll use like their job or their roles to like define themselves, and that forms the identity. And you can't really form an identity out of the whole self, so it's going to be misleading inherently.
I wouldn't characterize it as misleading. I think that it's a communication technique, right? Like, you're trying to help someone else know you better than like absolutely nothing. I mean, you're not always gonna get the chance to like have a, I don't know, like a 3-year relationship with someone so that they really get to know yourself, right? Like, that's not always gonna be available, but sometimes you need to let someone know who you are. So I think in those instances, identity can be really helpful, even if it's an incomplete story.
Well, I think the issue is that any story, regardless of whether it's complete or incomplete, is just that, a story, And a story or a narrative is something that we make sense of our lives with, but ultimately, I feel like it's the fixation of our time. And I mean, now it's slightly different. It's like, people no longer look at their lives as if they're in a narrative. They look at their lives as if they're in a TV show, right? But it's the same underlying problem of something that is supposed to be descriptive of life is now used to define it. I think that's the same for identity. It's one thing to use identity to like simplify like thinking about your life. It's another thing to define your life in terms of identity.
Yeah, there's definitely a practice that I'm not personally a fan of, that sort of like letting your identity define you rather than it going the other way around. I think lots of people fall into that trap. But I think, we're like 18 minutes in. I think for that, it really will be helpful if we go a bit deeper into the questions. They can sort of like guide us in the way of thinking about that practice or lots of other things relating to identity. So do you guys want to add anything? Should we jump on to the next question? And we can always get back to identity, obviously. Well, that's the topic. So
yeah.
Alrighty.
We can move on.
So, question 2. Is there such a thing as identity groups? For example, gender, race, nationality, class. Can these make a group that share an identity?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know. All these, you can really do anything with identity. It's to form any like group you want. Like, it can be arbitrary, and like all these groups identify all in like specific categories, which makes them a group. So
Yeah, I think it is, well, I'll tell you, I think it has to do with a problem that Peter, I think you were describing. Let me know if I'm on the spot here or completely off of it. Um, it's sort of like, you know, when I got into programming for the first time, um, I really felt like, I became a programmer, it like became part of my identity. It's sort of like, because I found like these online communities that are all about programming, and it seems like, these people had a lot in common with each other. And I was like trying to fit into that whole group category. Um, but then at some point, I feel like it sort of defined my identity. And I know multiple people, studying computer science at the university at the moment. I know many people whose identity or like personality almost is defined by them being programmers. Like these are people who spend almost all of their time either coding, talking about code, or watching tutorials or YouTube or whatever about code. Um, and I think coding communities is probably the reason, or at least an accelerator of that practice. Because you sort of try and, when you find something in common with so many people, that's something as huge as like a whole perspective on the world, right? I don't think programming should be a perspective on the world, but it kind of is in a way. At least it can be. So then, I think when you have something like an identity group, it can often lead to people using identity to define their personality rather than having a personality that also includes that identity. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I definitely am not really a fan of computer science. I'd call it like computer science culture, like programmer culture. It's just, I've talked about this before, probably on air. There are some people that like their dream is like to study algorithms are really hard and get really good at like the coding interviews, and then go and then interview at Google and then go work for Google, and that's the dream, right? And that kind of thing just makes me sick. But this is the pitfall of identity. Really, identity and demographics are tools of marketing, right? Like I'll give you an example, right? Are you familiar with the term tween?
Not really. Can you define it for me?
So tween is around 12 years old, and it stands for being between, because they're not teenagers, but they're not like little kids, right? They're tweens. But essentially, this term was made up by marketing teams in order to sell them stuff, or more likely sell their parents stuff, but to market them stuff at least. But now it's kind of an accepted thing, and I feel like a lot of identity is that way. It's like really it's just a convenient grouping for people to like target you with propaganda, essentially, and then any sense of community is a side effect of that. So I think computer science is like a good example. I mean, like I feel like a lot of it, like, yeah, sure, there are like some people that actually like enjoy coding and like good for them, but I feel like for most people the whole community is just about being a more effective worker drone.
That's a pretty hot take.
So I'd say that while there are such things as identity groups, I'm still mistrustful of the concept as it is often applied.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, do you have something to contrast this or add? If you don't, I will contrast. I'll play the devil's advocate here.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so I think like there are really pros and cons, to identity. I do agree that I find it shallow when people's like identity like creates like their personality, right, rather than like the other way around, as Dan said. But I think also really why I think in contemporary like politics and culture in general, there have been so many communities have like that have started that are like kind of surrounded by around like identity. Um, for example, you could think about like pole comp ball r/pole comp ball, where it's everyone is just obsessed with like their identity. They put like their political compass on on Reddit, and they're like, "What am I, you guys? I need to know all of these things." And identity politics and in the media, and obsessed with like race, gender, and all these things. And I think why this is happening is because we're living in kind of a meaning crisis, where God is dead, and we don't have any religious identity to cling to, so we kind of cling to all these other smaller identity groups. And I think that's is like kind of the good part of identity, though, is that it gives us meaning in our lives, to a large extent. So yeah.
I think this is hard. I'm gonna try and debate that, but also play devil's advocate. So it's kind of like, I don't know, trying to play both sides here. But I kind of feel like it's hard. I think I do see there being a bit of a meaning crisis at the moment in culture and non-religious areas of the world. But I think that isn't necessarily the same or like the same exact phenomena leading to people trying to find identity groups. I think that has more to do with a search for a community. This is especially true, I think, for the whole programmer community, but I think there are many others like it, where people sort of don't feel as happy or safe within their own individuality and their own individual lives. So they sort of try and find a group that they can belong to and sort of support them, whether emotionally or socially, just sort of have a group, like a collective, that can sort of keep you safe and successful, or at the very least, I don't know, stable and manageable, compared to like a certain terror people can get from sort of individual responsibility. I think the community search, the search for community and search for meaning are very related, but I would definitely make a distinction. I think it's not exactly the same. And then to play devil's advocate, I'm, as I said before, not much a fan of sort of letting a community identity define you, or an identity group. But let's say, what are some advantages to that? For one, if you're an identity group, there's always sort of a shared value or a shared system of value that people in that community have. Like in the programmer community, there's basically a whole world of programming, right? So you can sort of get on a moralistic arguments about certain algorithms or programming languages. You can sort of I don't know, get into long form discussions about a whole set of ideas in object oriented programming. There's lots to talk about, but other than that, it's also there's the connectivity of it. You can try and find a job through someone you met on a programming forum online, and it's sort of just, it feels like you're in sort of like a tribe, right? Which I think there's a human instinct to sort of be in a tribe. And I think that is when that instinct is there, and it's there for a reason, evolutionarily, maybe there's a great advantage to actually being in a tribe, right? Maybe there's a great advantage to fulfilling that need. I don't know. Do you guys agree, disagree, and why?
Well, I think you're kind of getting to the heart of what I think is so dangerous about this, is if you look at it from a marketing perspective, let's say that people really want to be in a tribe, so to speak. People really genuinely want that. So you're trying to sell someone something. So, but what's the quickest route to selling them? It's not building a whole tribe and then making them part of that tribe. It's just giving someone the feeling of being in a tribe. In fact, that's almost better, because if somebody has a tribe, there's no marketer that can really take that away from them. But if the marketer is the one giving you the feeling of being in the tribe in the first place, then it can very easily be taken away. And you gotta produce and consume in order to maintain that special status. It's almost like I would think of what's it called? Like even just like a middle class lifestyle is like a certain sort of tribe, like the American dream and all that. But you gotta be like buying all this stuff in order to maintain it, So I think really, if anything, the desire for being part of a tribe is what makes identity so precarious, is that it feeds off that desire.
I'm gonna have a hard disagreement with that. I feel like, you're alluding to some real world problems, but I think you're overgeneralizing it. I don't know the statistics about it or whatever, but I don't think most identity groups slash I don't know identity communities out there form because of some evil capitalist conspiracy to market to groups, right? When I moved to the United States with my family from Israel, one of the first things my mom did was she joined a Facebook group called Israelis in Boston. We moved to the Boston area, and that group was huge, has thousands of members. And through that, she found people in our community, neighbors even, that she can sort of show around, try to build a place in the community here in Boston. I don't think, in fact, I know for a fact you can't put any type of commercial / advertising material on that Facebook group. It doesn't have any fundraising, nothing, no exchange of capital whatsoever going on there. So I would be hesitant to say the reason why people search for community is they've been misled to that by marketers. Now, granted, I will definitely admit there's clearly lots of communities that are either generated by marketing departments or at the very least highly targeted by them. The first thing that comes to mind is the gamer community, right? Here's, gaming is sort of just a hobby. At least it used to be basically a hobby, right? People just bought this old fashioned console and then just played, some weird game. I mean, it wasn't old fashioned at the time, right? But it was basically born of people just liking some game or whatnot. And then I think in recent decades it sort of became the whole culture. I don't know how much of it was natural and how much of it was sort of advertising going for we're gonna be popular in gaming culture, and then everyone is gonna have to buy your game because look, all your friends everywhere are talking about this one new game. A lot of times people in gaming culture do that, and I find myself asking is Among Us that good that people generally, naturally all decided to download it, or is this some sort of insincere plot going on here? I mean, it is fun, but
Yeah, I think I think though in our current culture, community outside of marketing communities are becoming increasingly rare though. I think and this is in part because of women going into the workplace. Women are oftentimes really the cornerstone of community. So many communities were built in suburbs by just housewives talking to each other. A lot of that is lost because we're all working so much now. And I agree with Peter. There's definitely a danger to identity when you get into tribalism and stuff. You see this stuff in Nazi Germany, and Soviet Russia, places like this where you're where people just blindly follow orders, through the tribe. But there's also something, you need a healthy amount of tribe, because if you don't have tribe, then you kind of get what we're having in our culture now, which is a meaning crisis. Um, and like some people, like a few amount of people, will be able to like individually be able to create their own meaning and stuff. But I think the vast majority of people really struggle with that.
I mean, this is again the point where I sort of would jump to a distinction between the two. I think they're so tightly related, but they're still significantly different. So I think you could have a healthy community that you belong to while still needing meaning, and you can have lots of meaning while still needing a community. Although I definitely think if you have neither, then you're more desperate for both, right?
They're
And as far
definitely
as
both causal.
yeah, but I would say also, here's an interesting. Well, I hope it's interesting. Here's a test I've come up with. Tell me what you think of it to sort of, I guess, loosely tell you how real your community is. I think there's almost like a size test. Like, if you're in a tight knit friend group of like, I don't know, 8 people, I don't know how much that is really a community. Like, 2 people move away and then it kind of fades. Like, I don't really know how much that is what people traditionally think about as a community in our culture, or cross culturally. But what I would say is like, there's also the other point where like, if you're in a community that's more than 200 people, like you don't know the vast majority of your community. I don't think that's real community. I don't think that's real identity group. Sorry, I think we went on a tangent. So like, if you define yourself by an identity group as large as like, I don't know, women, or like, I don't know, like, if you define yourself by like, I don't know, all Jews, right? Like there's large groups out there, that if you try and define yourself by that, I think you're doing something wrong, because first of all, it's not a community, really. It can't be. If it has more than like, I don't know, 1,000, if it has like more than 200 people, is it really a community? I don't think so. Like, you tell me what you think the limit should be, but I think there's a hard limit. And then also, I think it should never be defined by community, but like, I don't know how much you can even belong to an identity group when the identity is that large.
Yeah,
Or
I think.
just in terms of people.
Hmm?
You said you can't belong to an identity group when the identity is that large. Is that just the amount of people that have that identity?
Oh yeah, I think it is, because like, look at it that way. You can try and define yourself by, say, I don't know, like all Jewish people. I could define myself as like, I'm Jewish, so I could say like, I define myself by being Jewish. Well, what does that mean? Like, do I really have more in common with all Jews, or like with more people living in my block? Like, it's just such a large group that I don't really think I have more in common with all Jews than I do, like, I don't know, even like people in my office. Like, when you get that large, there's just such a vast variety of people that the common denominator, it doesn't really even matter so much.
I mean, I would agree with that in a large extent. If anything, I would say that's just like an artifact of the internet that makes us think that identity is so much more like broad spanning than the people that you're like just physically close to. Whereas like, before the internet, there wasn't even a comparison. You read about those other people in like the newspaper, maybe. That's about it.
Yeah, and I think like an identity group can make a community form. Like, there's definitely like religious communities of like religious Jews living in Brooklyn, right? Like, that's a community. That's probably like one of the most real communities. But like, when you try to extend it to like one characteristic and then try to make a community out of that, I think like that's delusional. Like, it's not really a group. The thing that it shares pales in comparison to its differences among its members.
I would largely agree with that. I think I think though you can, be a part of a community like that, but it's a far less meaningful community. Uh, in your distinction, between like just a group of people, an ethnicity, a gender or whatnot. That versus like a specific area of people who like interact with each other. Um, yeah. So yeah, I would largely agree.
Do you guys want to add anything before we jump to question 3?
Let's go.
All right, this is an interesting one. Do your experiences constitute your identity? If so, are they the only thing that constitute your identity?
Huh. I think probably they do, but it's not always a good thing. Like one thing that like you may have like seen discussed is like people like identifying as like a victim, and then I feel like you're pretty much screwed if that ever becomes your identity. There's not really any getting out of that once you're in that mentality. But that obviously can stem from like some past like experience. But I think that's almost like the issue of identity is like once you have that experience, once you are victimized, it becomes all too easy to identify as a victim.
I've definitely heard of like psychologists that help people who have been victimized try and change their mentality and think about themselves as like stronger and less vulnerable. So I think there's definitely something there. But I would still think there's a large portion of your identity that's truly formed by your experiences. Like I think if anything, it's hard. I wouldn't say that your experiences are the only thing that constitute your identity, but in a sense they are. Like other things that may constitute your identity, like your values or like characteristics about you, certainly there's lots that define your identity, but I think it's almost like an abstraction above the basic thing that's like your experiences. Like if part of my identity is being a student at UMass Lowell, what does that mean? What does that characteristic mean? It means I've experienced things that a student at UMass Lowell experiences, right? So in a sense, I think it is basically experiences. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Well, there's a difference between experience and mere experience, but you can go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, experience is, of course, a big part of your identity. But I think it's more discerning than that. Like, it's, you have a number of different experiences in your life, but like, to have an identity is kind of to like prioritize some of your experiences over others, and kind of make a narrative story out of those experiences. And like when you make an identity, right, you're also um like pushing away other experiences that you had that like you don't want to identify with because like you hated that experience or whatever it is, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Let me think about it. I don't know if I have anything to add.
Yeah, like identity, I think, like I think Lacan talked about this as well. It's really about like self consciousness. I think Lacan had a thing like how Freud has like kind of stages in your life when you're like growing up like very young. Lacan had a similar thing. There was a stage called like the mirror phase, and that's when a baby first like recognizes like themselves in a mirror, right? And then when they can recognize themselves in a mirror, they can. That's when they form an identity. That's their first like instance of having an identity because they before they weren't self conscious, right? Because that's what identity is, it is being conscious of yourself, right? And so like the very first thing when you think identity is just like, oh look, there's me, right? Like kind of just your body. Oh,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I think one of the only things I would think are or could be outside of that, like outside of your experiences that could still define your identity, is sort of like abstract ideas, that don't have to do with your experience. Like, I think there's part of the religious story of the Bible. I think talks about, I think this is in Genesis, on how I think it basically describes it like man was created in the image of God or something like that. And I think there's an idea behind that that's interpreted by people as sort of like there's a divine spark in people, right? Like all people have sort of like some divine spark in them, kind of like a piece of divinity or a piece of God, right? I think many people who believe that then would sort of have a part of their identity be that, right? Like a certain part of God, which would have nothing to do with their experiences. So that makes me think, because identity is self-determined, like it's basically your conception of yourself. I think part of it can be construed completely outside of your experiences.
Well,
Yeah, I mean it.
your experience
Sorry.
them to believe in this divine spark.
What was that?
Isn't it exactly their experiences which lead them to believe in this divine spark?
I wouldn't say so. Like, well, obviously, it was an experience at which they learned and started to believe that they had a divine spark, but I don't think that in itself is an experience. Like, I think the point of it almost is, it's in you no matter what experiences you might have had. It's sort of independent of your experience.
I see what you're saying. Though
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by experience.
yeah. I'm sorry, Mark. You were saying something earlier, though.
What was I saying? Oh yes. Yeah, I think you can make stuff up really with your identity. It doesn't have to be really based on anything. You can just say tomorrow, oh, I want to be an owl, right? And then I don't know, and try your best to identify as an owl as much as possible.
Yeah, it's almost similar to the idea of having divine spark. It's sort of like it's an idea that you've come up with, but if you can get yourself to believe that it's true about you, that means it's part of your identity, because identity is your conception of yourself. It's not your true self. So if you make the distinction, yeah, I think you can be an owl. It's kind of a cool concept. I think some people are, if I'm not mistaken. Like, I think there's a group of people online. I don't know how many of them are offline as well. I think they're called Otherkin or something like that. So that's interesting.
I mean, that's what I was thinking of too, but honestly, I don't know if anybody would be able to believe they're an owl. I think the farthest most people would be able to go is believing that they believe that they're an owl.
I don't know, man. People across history have believed some really weird concepts, right? Like, there's been weird beliefs out there. I mean, still, many people in the world believe things that we would consider, I don't know, counter to evidence, let's say. Right? Like, I don't know, I'm sure many people believe that birds are really just drones. Like, I don't know what the number is, right? But there's, like, schizophrenic people out there that believe drones were made, birds were, like, a government conspiracy, and they're actually all the drones spying on you. So, like, I don't know how far that is from believing that you're an owl. I don't know if a healthy human, if that's a thing, if there's such a thing as the healthy human, I don't know if that can believe that it's an owl. I don't want to insinuate that people who believe they're an owl are not healthy, but, like,
I do.
I don't know.
That. I don't care.
Well, I'll do a free rock trick here. Free rock is a radio show that I run, but let's just say the Unlightenment podcast does not mean to offend or insinuate any particular people in the population, regardless of the opinions of its guests. All right,
Yeah.
that's my liability protection. I don't know. All right. Do
Open
you
up.
guys have anything to add? We don't have much time, but we can either jump to 4, or I think there's an interesting question, and 6 and 7 are pretty interesting, and kind of want to get to them if you guys don't mind skipping a bit ahead.
Yeah, let's skip ahead.
All right, so
Whatever you want to do, Dan.
let's try and do both. See if we have the time. Question 6: Is identity a constant or a fluid thing? Does identity change over time?
Oh, that's a cool one. I would say it does, but I think that there is part of the self, call it a soul, if you will, which is immutable.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. I think lots of identity can be fluid, but I think some of it will probably always be constant. I don't know how much, right? But, well, actually, I don't know. It's kind of, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I don't know that it's impossible to make the whole thing fluid. Like, if you can believe you're an owl, truly and sincerely, then I don't know if there's any part of your identity that is not subject to change at all.
I think
Who is the you that believes that they're an owl? It's like the classic ship of Theseus, you know? Like, if we're saying that a thing has a mutable identity, that means that it has a different identity from point A to point B, but you still need to be able to identify it as being the same underlying thing at point A and point B. So there's a limit on how mutable identity can possibly be.
Yeah, I'll give you this much at the very least. I will definitely concede that the very concept of having an identity, like the very being of an identity, will always be there. I don't think you can get rid of your identity. Like maybe some brain trauma or something where like you're, a complete drop in intelligence, where you're back to being like a 3-year-old or is like unaware of who they are, maybe. But
what about oh, that's interesting. What about those people dissociative identity disorder? Those people who like literally they like they can be like different people. They see themselves as like different people,
like the whole split
and like they
personality
don't
thing.
remember. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Same thing.
Like
They
holding
changed.
complete identities at the same time.
Interestingly, that's only has happened. They've only had cases of that in North America,
Really?
Really?
Nowhere else?
as far as I know. Yeah, which might mean that it's more socially constructed, but who knows?
Like a
Well-
copycat phenomenon? Or like someone invented it and other people are copying it?
I think
I don't know.
dissociative identity disorder only manifests in cases of extreme trauma most of the time. So I think it's more like it's not that the disorder itself is socially constructed. Like I would say probably in a different culture it might be different, but it would still be something. It just so happens that our particular culture allows for dissociative identity disorder. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think the alternative is dissociative identity disorder or nothing. I think the alternatives are dissociative identity disorder or something else, some other sort of traumatic response.
Like some other PTSD types, I don't know, phenomena or disorder. Could be. But then for people
think,
who are, like dissociative personality, I think they are, in a sense, if they feel the way they seem to feel, I think that means they have multiple identities. Like, I don't think there's anything false about that statement. If identity is just your perception of yourself, which I think we've come to the conclusion that that's what it is, then I think their identity Yeah, I mean, I think they really have multiple identities.
In a sense, yes, but I think they sort of are aware that the other ones are fake. You know, like there's the main one. I'm not exactly familiar with this. It's a very rare disorder to begin with.
Yeah, I don't have it obviously, so I don't really know, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't know much about it either, but I think to speak from experience for me, like I think I can look at it as like I think Nietzsche said something about this, where in a person there's kind of a battle of wills, or like put it in Freudian terms, like a battle of like experiences, not experiences, desires, and people have conflicting desires within them, and at certain times, whether it's like when you're hungry or like when you are aroused sexually or like when you have to go to the bathroom, that person who is in those states is like a very different person, I would argue, from like a normal person who's totally, I don't know, not hungry, not sexually aroused, and doesn't have to go to the bathroom, and like I could see like a split personality disorder being like two wills that are like, I don't know, like almost like separated from each other, who like completely take over the person at like certain times.
Well, I think that can be part of it, but usually it's more of a defense mechanism, because keep in mind this is a response to trauma, usually some sort of ongoing trauma, and I feel like usually it's either to shield the self from certain experiences, or because a certain situation requires almost a different identity in order for survival. I mean, there was a podcast that had somebody with dissociative identity disorder on it, and essentially the things that she went through were quite horrific, and like it sort of made sense why someone would manifest something like this. It really is like a defense mechanism in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think, to try and, I guess, pull us back to the questions here, although I think this is a very interesting tangent at the very least. I think, Mark, you did touch on something that I think is a topic in and of itself, which is basically described in question 7. Would you mind if I ask it? And obviously, if you have anything more to add about associative disorder, we can always get back to that as well.
You can go on.
All right, so this is an interesting one as well.
We don't
Is
have much
identity independent of environment? And does a person's identity change with a change of environment? If so, what implications does that have about what identity is?
I think like environment can certainly influence a person's identity. I believe Hegel talked about this, where like oftentimes people's identity is formed from the very antithesis of like someone else's identity. Um, and so, that's like someone's environment. Maybe you want to rebel against the environment, so you take up this identity. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a very interesting phenomenon. It's like, in a sense, a lot of the cultural, what would we call them, like cliches surrounding identity are inescapable. Because even if you're not defined by them, you're going to end up defining yourself against them. I think that is really the underlying danger, right? Like, even if we bring it back to sort of like community and marketing and whatnot, even if your community is not defined strictly as like some sort of marketing scheme, your community is still going to follow the form that is sort of implicitly put forth by marketing as what community should be, just because we're so steeped in that media, or that kind of media these days.
Maybe. Yeah, I'll have to think about it more. I think that's all the time we have for today. So I'll let you have groundbreaking points, and then we'll say our goodbyes. Any groundbreaking points you'd like to make?
Groundbreaking points. I think one of the most annoying identities these days is just the identity of college students. Like it's like, what are you, like a child, an adult? No, just a college student. Like, it's literally the tween phenomenon all over again.
That is a hot take. I feel the ground shaking. All right, good point there. Mark, anything you'd like to
add? I agree with Peter on this. So yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely concur as well. All right, thanks for being on the Unlightenment. This has been our episode. Feel free to subscribe, share this, like this. Question your own mortality, whatever you'd like to do. And this is it's been Enlightenment. Keep in touch. We'll be back next week with Season 2, Episode 2. All right, bye now.